project who are here. Jenny Price, Jenny McPeters are both right next to each other. And Jocelyn, who I'm not sure if she's here, she might still come, who helped me with this book and contributed her knowledge that I learned a lot from. So thank you all for being here. Now I will start, and I'm going to give a brief overview of what this book is about and why I wrote it. So we all know Ferguson, August 2014. Ferguson was the center of a social justice movement that erupted as protesters took to the streets after Michael Brown was shot by a white police officer. He was an 18-year-old teenager, and he was unarmed. The uprising that resulted was clearly about this heartbreak, but it was also about the injustice of this action and how it was really marking what have been decades of accumulated insecurity here and inequality here. And on this anniversary, we're now 10 years out, as you all know, 2024, a lot of people are asking, what has changed here? And arguably, this is the position of this book, that not much has changed. Okay, there have been some changes in the elected leadership, for example. Ferguson saw its first Black woman mayor, and that's really important for representation in a city that was steadily shifting from a majority white to a majority Black suburb. And if you go down West Florissant Avenue, there are some new, pretty significant buildings, and this is one. This is the Ferguson Boys and Girls Club, and just farther down from it is the Ferguson Empowerment Center. Hi.
Hi.
There's seats up here.
Front row. I'm nice behind you.
So this is clearly new investment. But if we zoom out from these buildings, I think this is where it becomes very telling. Feel free to come in. You can see how the built environment here really has not changed. And there's the Empowerment Center. This is a street that still needs sidewalks. There's no trees for shade. This building and this neighborhood are in a food desert. That means that people who live here over half a mile, they live over half a mile from a source of fresh food, which is a grocery store, and they have low access to a car. These are neighborhoods that are still in need of better jobs, access to health insurance, and more well-funded schools. Schools, for example, that might offer the kinds of resources that this Boys and Girls Club has, such that we wouldn't need a building like this. So if we take this further, you could say we haven't seen a lot of change because there are still layers of structural inequality that are preventing those kinds of transformation. If we take it even further out to illustrate what I mean by that, you can look at how the Boys and Girls Clubs was brought here by some of the region's wealthiest industries and corporations that are the major donors to the nonprofit that is bringing this building here. To me, it represents this impossible setup that a new building like this has, and for planning and urban design and those of us designers who really want to bring change are up against. On the one hand, it's a kind of city making that's bringing a valuable resource to this part of the region. Obviously, kids who don't have access to this in their schools and at home can come to the center. On the other hand, those kids go home from here to the same situation that they're coming from. And some don't get to come here because this is one center here and there are other municipalities right around here that didn't get a center. So these things are uneven. It's a kind of city making also that is maintaining these existing relationships of power for those corporations that are enabling the project and that are funding the nonprofit here. Many of them are growing, and they're growing their wealth and the companies with extremes of tax subsidies and incentives, the kind of stuff that the maps start to really delve into. And those are taxes that might otherwise bring support to places like this. And I'm simplifying it a little bit, but this is just one example of the kinds of contradictory relationships that this atlas is trying to document. So the book is an attempt to unpack some of these inherited planning systems and tools and practices that are sort of maintaining the city the way it is, despite, in this case, like a moment of amelioration in a larger kind of set of issues. So now if you'll bear with me and just raise your hand if I'm going too fast or it's too complicated or something. I don't want to throw a lot of jargon around, but this is a really important drawing in the atlas, and it sets the stage for all of the maps in here. And it's a drawing of public policy. So this is zooming out again to the national scale. And this is here so that we can situate these changes I'm talking about in Ferguson in the context of the broader United States political economy. And this is setting the stage for this issue of like why private companies are even asked to change the city, right? Like maybe they don't even want that role. So the timeline is showing the last 100 years of urban development related public policy. And it's moving here from, this is time, with the different presidential administrations you can see coded in red and blue. And I'm noting that because as the years, you know, I'll speak to the blue and the red sections in a minute, but it's important to note that a big shift might have started under one administration, but then these systems were each maintained by Republican and Democrat administrations alike over the course of these 100 years. So in blue, what you're seeing from the 1940s to the 1980s or so is, let me just point up here. This line at the top is the line of the extreme of income inequality between the richest 1% of Americans and everyone else. So after the Depression, which is, you can't read it on this screen, but it's the noted right here, which was like the greatest time of income inequality until now. You can see the dip. And the blue period in here is when we had more socially oriented set of policies. There was a lot of government funding that was paying for libraries and local institutions. There were works progress. A lot of it, some of it was coming out of the war time. And some of it was, you know, part of the recovery from the Depression and other things. Social Security came out of that time, even the idea of public housing. So this is what's considered liberalism in our government. The extreme of this era, it should be noted, is that sort of in the way the housing was made that cleared entire historic neighborhoods, and we had the highway building program during this time. So in a way, it had, you know, all of this sort of a great time of civic imagination for this country, but it also went a little far. And it was primarily for the white middle class to have access to these things, although not the institutions necessarily. But in labor, anyway, I'm not going to go into it. So it went too far. So there was a backlash. So then from about the 1970s and on, the government would pull out essentially from this top-down planning, and cities lost major revenue as a result of this. This is then entering the Reagan era, so the ideology was also shifting to one of neoliberalism. And I'm not an expert, but this is sort of a fancy way of saying we're changing how we're going to provide for people. And the government was now going to be smaller, and instead of giving money to cities directly, we're going to put projects up to the market. And we're going to let competition and the things that come with being on the market, efficiency and these kinds of things, drive a better way to make the city. So the idea was that private development would generate taxes that would circle back then and help people. It's like the trickle down idea. And this is still pretty much where we're at. But after that, we saw all of these nonprofits come into the cities. And they cropped up because they could compete for grants that would then channel and through their entities and be used to change the cities. And for other projects, funding went to local private developers to carry out what the government had done before. So there were other ways then that things were subsidized, like for example, housing channeled now to private developers in this new system, but then there were like vouchers to get low income access through Section 8. So I won't go into all of that, it's later in the Atlas. But this is all what's considered this trend toward privatization. And the political economic story here, I'm spending so much time on this drawing and these ideas, because this is the backdrop of all American cities. And this is how, to me, how this scenario underlies what we see in Ferguson and everywhere else. And how it hits the ground in Ferguson and North County is particularly pronounced. And that is why we there's things we can learn from the region. That's why we should be looking at Ferguson. So now I'll talk a little bit about Ferguson. Ferguson represents a typical American suburb in that, in the beginning it was about building out ideas about separation from the rest of the city and creating these subdivisions. And it's a part of what we call the first ring suburb. So I think most of you in this room know the landscape of St. Louis. But the first ring is considered this band. And you're looking at the top half of the region. This is the city of St. Louis. So the dense downtown was here, and the city kind of grew outward back in the early part of the last century. And that growth gave returning veterans, it was during that blue period in the prior drawing. So that growth gave returning veterans access to housing. If you were white, access to move out here. This is kind of what some people consider white flight. And industries had relocated out here already during the wars, and there were manufacturing jobs. This was a lot of small communities that were worker communities. And this is typical all over America, these early first rings. But in St. Louis, there was a racialized layer, and probably like elsewhere as well. And a lot of these growing communities ended up incorporating as cities, because that allowed them to recruit access to the tools like zoning and these other tools that could restrict multifamily housing and avoid integrating. So this is a close-up of an area of North County here in that first ring. And these are all tiny municipalities that are incorporating around 1937, 1940, 1947. Ferguson, of course, on the one hand, it's the typical suburb. On the other hand, it's already an exception to the rule. It's an outlier here because it was incorporated way earlier, 1894. It was already a rural bedroom community to St. Louis at that time, enabled by the streetcar system. but it became part of this fragmented landscape. Now we have over 88 municipalities here, which is not typical for American cities. And you're looking at the drawing of the larger metropolitan statistical area, which is over 1,000 governments, which is even crazier. And remember, all of these tiny municipalities, especially North County, each have to compete for development that will generate revenue. Because if we fast forward, we're now in the 1980s and 90s, remember these cities have been majorly stripped of funding. So then as other changes came to manufacturing and the highways and policies that encouraged growth of the suburbs outward, the population started shifting. So here we are again. Most of you here know about the stark racial divisions we have in our region. That's the Del Mar Divide in black. And again, this is the city of St. Louis, and this is the county in which all those tiny municipalities that I'm talking about are up here. Ferguson is right here. Ferguson, so the population is shifting farther out with all of these other changes. And Ferguson, all of North County really, finds itself in a perfect storm. It's already in a very fragmented situation. It's now demographically transitioning and an aging suburb with declining revenue in a privatized, growth-oriented market still. So it's still operating in that pink side of the timeline where all the tools are designed to multiply wealth for the largest companies that it is, to kind of trickle down. So this to me is the kind of incompatibility that makes such a pronounced case here in places like this. And since a lot of these incompatibilities or contradictions, in places like St. Louis have the added layer of being so racialized, it leads to exploitation. It's a growth-oriented context with low revenue and low access and high, competition and losing residents and everything else. So that kind of exploitation that results has hurt communities of color the most. These are the dynamics that are all underlying every map in this book. And hopefully this is helping to explain why I've remapped the city. The atlas is 100 maps of a place you probably already know, and a lot of conditions that you've seen before. But my hope is that the atlas gives you a new lens through which to see the place you thought you knew. And you can now, the maps are intended that you can see some of these conditions through this lens of the politics and the economics, which is essentially a large part of this structural inequality that I'm talking about. Now I want to just kind of step back for a minute and mention the title, because I think I probably would have sold twice as many books if I didn't call it Radical, and I realize that. Radical turns people away, especially in this day and age. It's people think it means something really jarring or extreme. But the term that I use, the kind of meaning that I use of the term comes from, radical is a word when you look it up that comes from the Latin word for root, like radish. So as a title, it points to how this is an atlas of root structures. There are a lot of different roots, of course. And as an atlas, that's why it's kind of like a catalog. And if you've seen it, my friend called it neurotic back when I was putting it together. But it tries to cover a lot. It's a big cross section. And now I'm going to go through some of the sections of the book. There are 5 main sections, and I'm going to kind of move quickly through a lot of maps, and I won't explain them all, just in the interest of time, and maybe we can have more conversation after, but just to kind of give you a sense of these, the way the book travels. So it starts off in territory. This is to give us the kind of very broad geographical and historical context. And to find, where we are, so to locate Missouri in some of these, early contradictions. This is showing the Union and slave-owning states, which Missouri, even back at that time, was both. This is also meant to help us see back in the day, like 400 years ago, several hundred years ago, other mechanisms and other practices that were enabling growth and exploitation. So generating wealth for some at the expense of others. And you're now looking at the region again, city of St. Louis and the county, but this is a map of the native peoples that lived here. The space chapter brings us to the ground and introduces the idea of the physical fabric and the suburb as, all of the kind of rules that made the suburb as it is today, and the kinds of tools that maintain this divisions of race and class out here in the suburbs. And it covers a lot of the physical fabric, like I said, landscape and trees and the roads, all the way from walkability. And I kind of put this one in here just so I have a chance to talk about the fact that this is not Ferguson. This is Calverton Park, which is just north of Ferguson. But I put this in here to say this is not, the Atlas is not trying to disparage Ferguson. But things like walkability impact everybody. They impact all of these suburbs. And that's another point of the book, is that so many of these policies are hurting all suburbs' ability to address the environment and ideas of social cohesion. This map is, these are the walk circles from this tiny community, Calverton Park. It shows how all the amenities are up here at the highway because they're chasing this regional market. And that's what generates taxes, but also bad urbanism. And it also shows that the walk score out here in Wildwood, out in the county, is even worse. So this section goes all the way to the scale of the subdivision and the parcel. And then we move from there into opportunity, which picks up after space to further explore the idea of the parcel and the structures of property and property ownership. Because this was such a big part of how the white middle class in the suburbs was able to generate wealth and access to opportunity through access to property. And it looks at the sort of maintenance of that access today. And the map is redlining, which you might have seen before. So it starts us off at that historical period. In here, the 1937 maps that you might have seen that were restricting, already putting labels on parts of the city that were largely African American, according to who, might have access to these home loans. And this chapter goes on and looks for current day manifestations of that kind of exclusion. It also looks at renting. So there's a section that goes through the low-income choice vouchers that are channeled through the private sector, and that all leads into the next part of the chapter, which is about education, because education is so tied to homeownership and taxes on property. The fourth section of the book is has the most on the political and economic kinds of systems that are at the root. And this is the biggest chapter. And I feel like some of these systems are the hardest to see because they're invisible until we draw them. but they shape everything around us and how we live. So this, for example, we kind of zoom in again, we're in North County again. Ferguson is right there, and Berkeley and the airport, which is right there, as many of you know. And for example, this map brings us into the direct relationship that these communities have with 3 Fortune 500 companies that are located right there. And this is something that Walter Johnson has written about, that I'm sort of mapping out of his book. And the drawings in this section are looking at the different private influences that are building the regional corporate wealth here, and the various ways that that's impacting North County. So all of the incentives and tax credits and all of that kind of stuff is in here. And it's important to note that it's not one size fits all. So even though we're looking at all these municipalities in North County, the book does dive into a couple instances where you can trace some of these incentives and how they hit the ground differently. So for example, TIF is one of these common planning tools. It stands for tax increment financing. And it's supposed to help developers actually be able to invest in a declining area because it gives public money up front to pay for like the infrastructure costs or something. And the idea is that that's going to come back as future taxes. This is a common tool. But the map here is showing where TIF was applied in the region, the downtown strip of Ferguson and Kinloch, which is an important municipality right next door. And the critique in Ferguson was that TIF, it really wasn't for people who live there because there is another zone, it's off the map, up here where those highways were in that walkability map. That was all given the TIF incentive. So people complain, this is catering to regional markets, even though that brings taxes. It's arguable whether it's worth it in that case. And it applies to also the historic center, like I mentioned. So here is what that strip looks like in Ferguson, where there's access to this incentive. In Ferguson, they're still waiting for development. But when you look at Kinloch next door, you end up with a different extreme of the application of the TIF. Here, it allowed industry to basically replace the town itself. And it depends on how long of a time period you're looking at this, because there were clearings related to the airport. So it's part of a much bigger story of redevelopment. But TIF there, which remember, TIF is supposed to help developers enter into these declining areas to give them amenities, so where they wouldn't be able to make a profit. But here we have these major Schnucks distribution warehouses, 20-foot fence and barbed wire. So it's clearly not related at all to the development. And incidentally, these are food distribution warehouses, totally unrelated to Kinloch, which is in the food desert, that never, crosses that fence to get to Kinloch. And Kinloch is significant as the first African-American municipality to incorporate in the entire state of Missouri. Some of you may know the story of Kinloch. It's a very significant place in the history of St. Louis. It was considered the all-black town. So the book actually, because some of this builds on my prior work that I've done, Kinloch, so the book has this little case study in it that looks more carefully at what's going on there related to the airport and these other dynamics. Lastly, the justice section speaks to the systems of excessive tickets and fines. That is probably the thing that most know best from 2014. And the racialized policing that happened there and continues in different ways. There were, for example, the number of stops has reduced, but the disproportionately Black drivers who are stopped has increased. So this section covers some of that, and then it goes on to look at health and in a way that's related to access to health insurance and other things. Health insurance, of course, which is privatized and tied to having a job that has those benefits in there, and then it goes on into talking about the environment. So the book is just really scratching the surface of all of these very complicated issues of place and power. But it leads to the question, especially for designers, like, where are we going to go from here? Like, what do we do? So that was very important to me, especially as we teach. We talk about ideas all the time. So at the end of each chapter, there's a set of mobilized maps. And those maps are pointing to tools and practices that we already do and that we should further and do more of. So these are just some of them. And I hope to maybe develop a website after this, and if I can do that, I will add to the mobilized maps. And just quickly, I want to have a word about maps, just to talk about maps. Because I'm an architect and an urban designer, and I see the world through drawings. Because I think I've kind of like questioned, like, why'd you draw all this? Why'd you do a book of maps? It's easier to draw than write, actually. And maps are tools for getting to know a place. It's a tool that we use. And I'm interested in the politics and the policies because those are the things, those structural underlays are what prevent us from implementing so many of the good ideas that we have. For example, we can come up with ideas for how to be resilient and make better spaces. We can design great libraries, but in the end, kind of hits a wall when you're working within this very constricted context. The other thing I like about maps is that everyone can read maps. And part of my goal with this book was to bridge what I've learned over the last 20 years of teaching at WashU and conversations with students and my understanding of American cities, and to bridge out of academia into the public to sort of share some of this, some of these stories that we've learned. And I think maps felt like a way to do that because everybody can read them. Also, as we know, here's the redlining map again from 1937. Maps have been instruments of power. They have controlled who has access to the city, very much like in this era. And so I'm interested also in reclaiming maps to kind of control, okay, who might have access to the city through the way we can remap some of these really complicated things. And the city is really complicated, but I like the way the maps can allow us to sort of delaminate it and peel it apart and then remix the layers and put them back together in a way that we can see new correlations between things we thought might not exist, be related. The maps zoom in and out, as you've seen. We're looking at the region, we're zooming in. Maps let us see the different patterns and isolate issues close in. And I'm just saying that because if you get lost, there's an atlas guide. So the start of the atlas has all of the maps in the book. And if you ever need to know where you are, you just come to this and you can see, oh, I'm on that map number. And the last thing that I want to just close with now is a point about this book of 100 maps. The intention is not to take this as this big abstraction of the world, because maps are abstract. That's just the nature of them. But to use it to help us understand actually how serious these issues are for all of us. The maps are meant to help us see a place, sort of see it in new eyes, a place that we call home, a place that we love, and that is meaningful for all of us. So it's important to remember from the abstraction that this is really about people. And I'll leave it with that.
Patty is willing to answer some questions. I have got a I've got a microphone here that I can run around. Does anybody have any questions?
This was amazing and just so interesting to see, and I can't wait to dig into the book. One thing I'm curious about, so the story you tell is a lot about injustice and inequality and conditions. And one thing that's interesting about the situation in Ferguson, obviously really important in 2014, is that not every injustice leads to resistance and leads to uprising. And I'm wondering if there are aspects of the story you tell that can help shed some light on why that place at that moment in time became not just another side of an injustice that got sort of swept away and forgotten, but became the spark for this incredible outpouring of energy and activism and resistance.
I think some of you are going to know the answer to that, maybe more than I do. Brendan? Where's Brendan? I think there were things brewing, but why did that moment in that time and that event spark such a outpouring? I don't know. I mean, we've seen it around other parts of the country. And certainly the Black Lives Matters movement already existed. It came out of the Florida shooting of a young man like many years before. So I think there were probably among this community, it wasn't like a random thing, but it was something that, part of what I talk about in maps and mapping is maps are showing new audiences conditions that people who live there know and experience and already know and live. So, maybe that's part of it. Like I don't know, I wasn't there, but I know others know, and we can, keep trying to find out.
Patty, really enjoyed your talk. Illuminating. I wonder from where you stand and from your experience studying a variety of cities, or how unique is what you see in terms of all the structural components you talk about to St. Louis, and how much of it is something, frankly, happens in a lot of cities across the country? And are there differences between cities, say, from up north versus south in terms of the extent of some of the elements that you talk about?
So the title of the book is Radical Atlas of Ferguson USA. And that was intentional, a way to allude to the fact that this is every American city. It's just that it's so pronounced here, and not even in Ferguson, actually, probably more in Kinloch and Berkeley and some of the neighboring municipalities. It's, the book anchors on Ferguson because it's tying to the event a little bit, but it's about every American city. I think there are others that probably share the extremes that Ferguson does. My other book was on other American cities, and we looked at, it's the same tools, but in a high growth context, it just works differently. The St. Louis region is a weak market, to begin with, let alone North County. So, Boston, San Francisco, these tools are building the city. Like DC is exploding with development. So it's not that the tools don't work, it's that they need to be refined better for a place like Ferguson. Anyway, there are other cities. Okay, plug for my next book. It's on towns. It's rebuilding in towns, and Opa-locka, Florida is in there. And it has a similar relationship to the big metro. It's not far from Miami, but it's systematically disinvested, and it experiences a lot of the same things. And there's an executive airport right there, and all the tax money skips Opa-locka, and it goes right into this crazy executive airport, super wealthy people coming to Miami, and they got access to the incentives by saying they were in a disadvantaged community, but then the community is seeing nothing from it. So that there are examples, but I don't have, I don't have the full list.
Thanks, Patty. So I came tonight because I'm in municipal government as a local elected official. And so one of the big things that we do in these municipalities, in our municipalities here, is review and approve development and think about zoning, try to understand zoning and apply it and stuff like that. And I'm trying to think about what that means, what sort of power and opportunities we have to make change and what the change would look like. So I'm curious, so maybe two things. I'm curious a little bit how much the book is for me or other people, like the audience of the book, for the book, and what you how to think about it going through it.
It was definitely, this was an experiment on my part, talking to non-designers, but the idea was that this book could start a conversation here in the region among everybody who's trying to make things better. So policymakers, designers, activists, people on the ground, all these organizations that are working to bring change. So my hope is that it is written for you. The cities that are highlighted in here, again, they're extreme cases, but I think even in Clayton, there's kind of a critique of TIF. Why do we need TIF? It's taken away from the schools when, Centene has all this money. And, so it's sort of you hear those things again. I mean, again, it's hitting the ground a little differently, but my hope is that it is for you. And as you read it, let's talk. We can draw some scenarios.
I'll take you up on it.
Angela,
Well, you got to the, thanks, Patty. You got to kind of a policy question there a little bit. If you were queen, what might you change? Or I don't know if you've thought that far. You said it's a conversation for us all to have, which is not a conversation we haven't had for a long, long time, but you continue to graft it. But do we need to go back to the blue part of your timeline? When we had less inequality in income, and yet we had a lot of inequality racially and otherwise. Or do we need more federal largesse, collect money from around the country and distribute it differently so that some of these municipalities or local governments have more resources that, frankly, they're just not allowed to collect? The elimination of the earnings tax, for example, in Missouri, dumb idea. I mean, it minimizes the flexibility that cities can have to build on their strengths. So, any thoughts on being queen?
Well, this question from you is, Bob is knows a lot of this more than I do, your years of experience. So it's exciting that you're here. Thank you for coming. Do I have, what would I do as queen? I mean, so I was presenting this to students at Michigan last week on Zoom. And we were looking at the timeline and sort of remarking, we're at like a big arc. And what's it gonna do? Is it ready to go back down? You know, this inequality, or is it gonna go off the chart now? And I feel like we are at such a moment. So first thing I told all of them was vote. Although, as you saw in that drawing, all the administrations were sort of maintaining the system. So, you know, is voting gonna be enough? I mean, it'll prevent maybe the extreme, but maybe it's not gonna solve, we're gonna keep going. So I do not have the answers. In the design studios, we can speculate and we can really delve into what if at a more particular level. You know, as we're working on a project in communities, we can think about different kinds of tools and different sorts of models of, you know, there's just an article in the New York Times about social housing. Can this country like dare to imagine social housing? You know, it's like a bad word or something, but there's amazing models of that in Europe, and it's great. And it's a political will. I mean, we're at a crazy time, so I don't know. I'll give my queen crown to you, and then yeah, we'll.
I'm almost as old as Donald Trump, so I don't think I'm young enough to be president.
Okay.
Queen Elizabeth is older.
Angela had a question
Yeah, no, I wanted to ask you.
for the Zoom,
Oh, I don't do that.
for the people on the
Oh,
Zoom.
I'm sorry, okay, sorry. I wanted to ask you about process, you know, because this is such an amazing undertaking. And I guess, well, first of all, I wanted to say that I'm not convinced that everybody can read maps, especially with the rise of GPS. And the reliance on GPS is, I think, terribly dented our ability to read maps. But there's so much amazing, as you say, laminated information in these. I guess my question is about the heuristics of the process. In other words, you know, you didn't know what you were going to, how much did you discover in the process of actually putting all this together? Was it kind of unfolding over time that, you know, you're literally kind of unveiling these structures as you put all this information together?
Some of it is definitely that, but this book is the product of over 10 years of looking at the region. It's sometimes in classes with students who are generating data and asking questions and conversations we're having. Other times in my own work, just literally using drawing. You know, let me pile all of these things that are happening to this neighborhood on top of each other. You know, let's draw the boundaries of the tax district and see where it aligns, and then you can start to see concentrations and correlations. So some of it is for sure discovery, and other stuff is, you know, I know this is here and we need to show it.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of that also, but the drawing is, you know, you're seeing the finished maps, but you know, maps can be really messy part of the kind of process of understanding and learning. And those are the best. You're just like seeing what you get, what's going on.
What was your biggest aha moment where you like something kind of jumped out of you?
I mean, if you really want me to go into it, I'll try to say it quickly. I don't know if this is the biggest, but this is a useful illustration. The you know, there's a lot that's been said about the historic redlining, the maps that were, you know, about steering where people could buy houses and creating areas of the city saying, you know, that they were like, these were considered not safe to give a home loan because they were largely African American at the time. And every American city had these maps drawn. This is 1937. The Home Owner Loan Association, HOLC Corporation, that was making these. So a lot of people look at this and say, well, clearly this is a big part of why we have this inequality in the region. But when you overlay that, for example, here's this enlarged area. So here's Ferguson. When we overlay that, we can see, and this is the area where Michael Brown was killed. where most of the low-income housing is. And there's this sort of like, oh, it wasn't redlined at all. So it just tells us that these histories, they are still impacting the region, but they're not the full story. There's a lot of other things going on today that are happening, and you know, the fact that this is where the low-income housing is now, it's a kind of a creek that has a flood zone. There's Emerson Electric was right there, so it was industrial. So at the time, it wasn't developable. But now, you know, when we have low-income housing put in through the private sector, they need a bargain on the land, and this is access to land. So it's a kind of a exploitation that we see today, and it's in the gaps of the redlining. So just a way to say some of these things, you know, that we're pointing to, we need to remember that it's not the full story. That makes sense?
We have time for maybe one more question.
Okay, Patty, thanks. The maps are, you know, amazing. I mean, I've always loved this. It's just, I think, such a huge contribution, innovation, you know, to really visualizing these problems that so many people have written about. But, and I'm not sure even this should be the last question, but you also have a lot of text in here. And I was wondering, as a writer, if you could talk to us a little bit about your process for choosing what to write in this book, because the texts are, you know, they're very condensed, right? They're very, and like, if you could just tell us a little bit about sort of what's in those, because we can't really read here. Yeah.
Well, there's definitely call outs. I mean, the text is working hierarchically, like with the graphic. So I'm trying to use the page to address different levels of readers. This is kind of like what we learn in maybe graphic design or something. But some people are going to look at this map and it's like too complicated to figure out. So you have this bar on the left that's telling you what you're looking at. It's kind of the go-to. Like, I'm an analog person, let me just see what this map is about. You can't read it because the screen is pixelated. The other blips are just trying to succinctly explain the context of the map. Again, to sort of help us have that lens. You know, if this is a drawing we've seen before, I mean, this particular one, I don't know, but the redlining, for example. So that text at the top is asking us to look at something we think we know in a slightly different way. And the atlas has this these don't show it, but there's this cross-reference system at the top, because so many of these topics then apply to other things in the atlas, and so putting it together in a book that has an order was kind of hard. And I explained the organization that it came out with, but you can always sort of hyperlink this way to, you know, if we're talking about redlining and access to loans again, which is what this drawing is about in contemporary times, you know, then it's sending us to see something else in the, you know, other part of the chapter or another part of the book that circles back on this from another angle. So you can follow a topic across the chapters with this little secret system.
Everyone, let's give one more wonderful round of applause. Yes, thank you all so much for being here. We have got Radical Atlases for sale at the front desk if you don't have yours yet. We are going to get some books signed in the main room. We're going to get a table set up there. Patty was also wonderful enough to bring some refreshments. So we've got drinks and cookies and things also in the next room. I can help kind of guide people around. Other than that, the store is open until 8. So thank you all so much for being here. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.